If you've ever heard somebody say solo or one-man CQB isn't real, that's okay. They just don't understand the reality of law enforcement officers. They've never had to respond to a 911 call by themselves. They've never had to kick open the door of an apartment or a residence looking for somebody who needs help, and that's okay. If you'd like to support the channel, you could do that by feeding the algorithm down below and subscribing to the channel if you're not already. In 2026, I have my own tactical gear coming out. If you'd like to get on the email list for when that launches, you can follow the link in the description to my website. Solo or one-man CQB is most relevant to 99% of law enforcement because those are the officers who are responding to calls by themselves. Maybe it's an active shooter, maybe it's a 911 hang-up, maybe there's somebody screaming for help when you get up to the apartment door. And actually, if you take a CQB class as a patrol officer and you actually are working around other officers doing CQB with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people, that's still not going to be your reality when you go out onto the street. That's the reality for SWAT teams who happen to have the same training and train together often. So when you're actually doing CQB as a patrol officer and you take that class, the most relevant things you can learn are from the individual's perspective. And so absent of a scenario, I'm going to talk about general rules as it applies to working a door. In most of my videos, you hear me talk about things that I call general rules. These are basic fundamental practices that most of the time you want to abide by. It doesn't mean that there aren't situations where it doesn't make sense, but for the most part, you do want to abide by these general rules. Just like in CQB, you never want to enter a room by yourself, but guess what? You might be by yourself, and at some point you might have to enter that room, and therefore you are breaking that general rule. So as it relates to working a door, there's a few things that we want to avoid when working the door. We want to avoid standing directly in front of the door, and we want to try our best to stay within a foot off of the threshold. This allows us, hopefully, to mitigate rounds coming through the door and any additional rounds that are being shot at the door and happen to hit the threshold because bad guys usually aren't aiming anyways. And so we understand that drywall isn't cover, but there's a lot of things in between that bullet and our face that isn't necessarily drywall and could deflect our rounds, whereas if we're standing directly in front of the door, we really have nothing to afford us that same opportunity. First, we have to identify what exactly is the problem that we are concerned about. And the problem is when the standard exists on the other side of this door. The standard is a person with a gun who's ready to shoot you at the first opportunity. Once we understand what the problem is, we can start asking ourselves, what are best practices at mitigating this problem? And in order to determine that, we have to agree upon a few things. We have to agree that standing here is bad, and standing here, exposing yourself to multiple angles you can't possibly cover by yourself is even worse. And that if you're standing here, this may give you an opportunity to get into the fight, because if I'm shot or killed, well, I'm really not being all that helpful, and I'm actually creating a bigger problem than we already have. Now that we understand that we want to mitigate the first volley of gunfire so that we're still alive to get into the fight, how you want to do that in this situation, if you have a rifle, or at least what I do in a video I showed you about the high ready and when it makes sense, is I'm going to assume that high ready position so I can control my rifle. And actually I want to lean in towards the door so that when I work the door, I don't have to shuffle my feet back. I'm already in a position that keeps me, 1, away from the door, and 2, away from as much of the threshold as possible. Obviously in this situation where we're only concerned about the door, none of these other doors here, like this is a hallway, I have this wall over here that makes this a little bit more difficult and not as advantageous in terms of my body position from the threshold. If I could actually get further away from the door, I would be about a foot away from the threshold as I work this door. And so there's a couple different techniques. There's one where they call letting it breathe, where you're actually popping the door open just like that and just seeing if you get a reaction. Again, if there's somebody in there with a gun, this is probably the moment where they start shooting at the door. Now, in order to do this in a way in which you don't make as much noise, which isn't all that relevant if the guy is in there watching this door, but this room could extend to multiple other rooms. And if this guy's in the closet or they're in the bathroom over here, maybe he doesn't even know that you're there yet, right? Or maybe he heard you, but he doesn't know exactly where you are. And so maybe it's not best practice to just make all this noise if it's not absolutely necessary. And so if you want to mitigate some of the noise coming from the threshold and the latch itself, you'll grab onto the door, pull the door in towards you, and then slowly release the door until you defeat the latch mechanism. That's going to be the way in which you can do this in the most covert way as possible. So you can do it that way. If we already have the door propped open just like this, You can reach forward and push it with your hand if you want to in order to get a little bit more standoff from the door. What I always like to do, and in this case I actually have the wall here to brace myself, is I'm going to use my foot. And in doing so, again, keeping myself as far away from the threshold and the door as possible. Now, before I even go to actually move on this door and start pieing the room from the outside in a slow and methodical manner, I personally would switch my rifle into my off shoulder. For those whose blood pressure just shot to the moon over me talking about switching shoulders, I have a whole video that you can go and watch. I'll link it in the description, where I talk about who, what, when, where, why, and how to do this, and I even provide you real world examples. Here's a clip of a 10th Special Forces guy talking about it.
The sling is a comfort item for me. I keep the sling around my neck because I'm about to get in a gunfight. I'm not sure what shoulder that this butt stock will be in. So it's very important to understand how we're manipulating the gun.
Now you guys can choose to educate yourself by gathering information from a bunch of different sources and choose to make your own decisions off of that. Or you can just continue to regurgitate the things that people say about certain tactics and techniques just because they're the ones that are saying it. You can also simply put the rifle in your other shoulder if that's something that you're capable of doing. I just personally don't like to do it that way. And so as the door comes open, I might do this initial assessment from here, especially if this is a corner or a center fed room and there's more room that way that I need to be, concerned about. This might not be something that I do right at the beginning, but if I get here and I do my initial assessment, if I want to minimize my exposure, personally for me, I would switch shoulders and I would start pieing the room from right here. If you can't hit a target off shoulder from 7 to 10 yards, that's not my problem. That's your problem. Unfortunately, if you don't switch shoulders and you start pieing the room, you're going to expose your head before you ever get a chance to get your muzzle onto the target. Then what I would do is I'm pieing this room, continue to collapse the room down from the outside. I would just clear as much of this room as I can, because once I get to this position here, for the most part, it's not necessarily clear, but I know what are the significant areas of concern as I enter this room by myself. If there wasn't some of this furniture here and there wasn't a little bit of dead space here, and I can see from right here that directly in front of me is 100% clear, and the only thing I can't see when I get to here is that right corner of the room right there. Well, guess what? Now when I enter this room, my entire focus is going to be only to this right side of the room. And so that's one of the benefits of being able to pie all the way across the door or all the way across the threshold. Now, in a circumstance where you're going to work this door from this side, this is a situation where I would not let the door breathe, right? Because in order for me to let the door breathe or do it quietly, let the door breathe, but to do it quietly is me spending more time in front of the door. And that's not what I want to do, because even this small movement right here could cause a suspect to start shooting through the door. And so if I'm going to reach across like this and work this door, I'm still going to get in that stance where I have to reach across again so that when I pop the door, I can move back. But this is actually just going to be something that you do quickly. Now from here, we can start assessing. Again, you can assume this high ready position and you can move up with your hand and you can push on the door like that. In my opinion, that's not what I prefer to do. Again, I prefer to get into a position where I can brace myself and I can use my foot, because in doing so, one, I can actually keep the rifle in my shoulder. I can get closer to my sights. I'm remaining on balance the entire time. In this particular case, I'm using the wall for support, and it's allowing me a little bit more standoff from the door itself. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that by subscribing and tapping on this photo. Don't forget to feed the algorithm down below.